Hey everybody, welcome to week 9. Thanks for getting your midterm in. I will have those back to you over the course of the next 2 weeks. So basically before spring break ends, I know that's a big assignment. I need a little more time to grade it, but I also know you guys want to get that back as soon as possible. So I will effort to get that back to you as soon as I can, answer any questions you have or anything like that. So the midterm of the semester really moves us. It gives us a nice breaking point between the early parts of the medieval era and then this transition to the English Renaissance, which is where we're going to be spending a good majority of our time over the next several weeks before we look at some other things in the 17th century. So just to point out to you a couple of places where we're going on the syllabus. So as always, if you need the syllabus, you can come here to the Start Here section, and then you get the syllabus. You want to update there. Okay, so let me slide down here to our schedule. So as you can see, this week we are doing an introduction to the 16th century, selections from Astrophil and Stella and Shakespeare's sonnets. And most of that work is going to be on the sonnets themselves. There's a good section in the textbook that explains to you some of the many changes that are going on in English culture at that time. And so while this is not that's something that we're going to talk about specifically this week, it will have implications and indications in the works that we read from this point forward. So I do recommend that you take a look at this section listed on these pages in your syllabus and in the textbook that show a lot of the crazy changes that are going on in the world. And they're not that unique in terms of the world is always shifting, but the period of time with which these happen and the fairly massive cultural swings that take place during what we would consider the reign of the Tudors is just, it's kind of wild how much happens from Henry VIII getting to the throne all the way through Charles I and Charles II. So much is going on in that period. So many cultural changes. You have the rise, you have the English Reformation as a response in a number of ways to what's already going on the continent of Europe, and then the influence of people having autonomy in their own decisions. You have the rise of the printing press, which now meant that you could actually have a career as a writer. If you remember, as we talked about Geoffrey Chaucer, and if you would actually see this in Philip Sidney, and one of the authors we're going to study this week, they wrote as a sideline to the other things that they were getting done. But with the rise of the printing press, you could actually have a career as a writer. And then you have the growth of the cultural impact of the theaters and this incredible new era of communication and depiction. And we'll talk more about that next week when we study Shakespeare's, or not next week, I'm sorry, in 2 weeks when we study Shakespeare's Othello. And anytime you have this influx of culture and things going on, you've got a lot of social categories that are shifting. At the same time that you have these social categories shifting, you have authors looking back to the past and into the Italian Renaissance, to Petrarch, and into other things going on the continent, and then thinking through crafting their own versions and presenting that to people. And so what we're really doing in this course is, while all of that is a major influence on the text we're reading, we're really focusing on the content of the text themselves and how they deal with these ideas of honor, virtue, chivalry, and loyalty, right, as we consider those 4 terms throughout the semester. And this week in particular, we're going to talk about the sonnets, and we're going to talk about courtly love poetry. Now, you saw a bit of courtly love in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in the treatment and interactions with Lady Burlak. It's highly emphasized in the Knight's Tale that we read 2 weeks ago, so that where you can see like this whole discussion of how beautiful they found Emily was, and how not only are they just feeling an intense emotional attachment to it, but they would say they're dying on the inside. We're going to see how these authors are continuing to push that idea forward in reference to a lot of Italian, especially as the person to think about there is Petrarch. But there's a lot of playing around with the form in some really brilliant ways, and the real growth of this sonnet form and into putting it into sequence. That I think is going to be a good place for us to discuss love. As always, the discussions are not always about just love. They are about what does love mean, and what does it say about us as people? What does it say about us as people of trying to be people of character and virtue? What does love do to us in that regard? So I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say about these works. All a recommendation to take a look at those chapters to understand all of the shifting dynamics that are going on in the world. And we're going to talk more about that in the coming weeks. And what we'll do is we'll try to look, as we look at individual texts like Othello and Milton's Paradise Lost and Dr. Faustus, this idea of, make sure, you know what, now that I see that, we're not actually doing Dr. Faustus. I forgot that I took it off the agenda. That's okay. But we're going to see a lot of influence in these texts, especially as we get to Othello and John Milton's Paradise Lost. So just read that chapter for some good general information, and then we'll bring up specific things each week. A note on the text this week. Our textbook makes selections because they don't have room to publish the full sonnets of either author. Some of their selections I have a bit of a quibble with because I'd rather them include some sonnets that I just think explore some of the themes a little bit differently. That's okay. That's their choice. They have different things in mind. So you'll see in the reading notes, which I'll show you in just a minute, there are some sonnets in there that are not listed or not included in the textbook. Now, I recognize that I've included the sonnets in full in the notes, so you don't technically need your textbook to complete this work this week, but I would recommend you just reading the sonnets and reading the information about Shakespeare and about Sidney to make sure you get a full understanding of what's going on in the world these days. So as I'm going to now move this off and go back to the week 9 assignments. So you've already been here, and then here are the reading notes that for this discussion. So you'll see here some introductory remarks about Philip Sidney and about Shakespeare. Now, Sidney is writing long before Shakespeare comes to the table, and so you can track the evolution of this between Sidney and Shakespeare. I don't know that reflects a massive shifting of the times. I'm sure that there are people that do. What I just wanted to bring to the table is just these two kind of significant examples in the sonnet form and in this courtly love poetry because of the way that they talk about things. Sonnets in particular are of interest because they're 14 lines of some kind of rhyme scheme, just depending on what the author wants to do. And typically they're split between the octave, which is the first 8 lines, and the sestet, which is the last 6 lines. And they will, a lot of times it's almost like a joke. They set up the joke, and then punchline is in line. The first, the octave is the setup, and then the payoff is the sestet, the bottom form. That's not always the case, and they're not always joking, but it is good to watch and track that idea. So, for example, I'm going to bring up Sonnet 1 by Philip Sidney. And if you hear this, enjoy, I think, as we move into more modern language, we're not having to translate near as much. You can hear the words and the rhythms as they're coming out. So, in Sonnet 1, you have, loving in truth and in feign, let me get started again. Loving in truth and fain in verse my love to show, that the dear she might take some pleasure of my pain. Pleasure might cause her read, reading might make her know. Knowledge might pity win, and pity grace obtain. I sought fit words to paint the blackest face of woe, studying inventions fine, her wits to entertain, oft turning others' leaves to see if thence would flow some fresh and fruitful showers upon my sunburned brain. This is one of my favorite poems of all time because it's so striking in its imagery of a person who is so inspired to write about this love of his life, and at the same time cannot find the words. That he has done so much to try to understand that, but then he recognizes, but my words came halting forth, wanting invention stay. Invention, nature's child, fled step dame study's blows. and others' feet still seem but strangers in my way. Thus, great with child to speak, and helpless in my throes, biting my truant pen, beating myself for spite. Fool, said my muse to me, look in thy heart and write. And so you hear that language there of he's trying all of these things, and his muse, his inspiration says to him, look into your heart, write from the heart. And we see so much of this discussion of love being the seat of emotion and heart, and that thing that we should want to give out to other people, but it so often gets trapped in these words. And so that's just one sonnet, but you can see how you have that split between the octave here and then the sestet here, where you see that resolution in that final writing couplet where Astrophil says, fool, like I will write from my heart. So Astrophil means star lover, right? Astro and then Phileo or Phil, that's the star lover. And then Stella is the name of his person he wants to be with. And that is obviously translated to star. And so what you're going to see in Astrophil and Stella is this unpacking of Astrophil's perspective. And he vacillates constantly between the peaks of emotion and the depths of despair. And if you've ever been in love, you know exactly what he's talking about. But there's an open question in Astrophil and Stella, and it's really a question of Shakespeare as well. So Philip Sidney wrote a fairly important literary critical work called The Defense of Poesy. And he says the real value of poetry and culture, and we'll call it poetry, I mean it's poesy, it's his definition of fiction, that the real value of fiction in the world is that it can do what philosophy and history can't do, which is it can teach and delight. And that by delighting, it opens people up for teaching. And what does it teach? It teaches virtue. And that term is one we're familiar with from previous parts in the semester. And his prescription is that good writers should pursue virtue and should depict scenes and characters and other things that present virtue as an ultimate good. So the question you might ask of Astrophil and Stella, and Astrophil specifically as he's going through these peaks and valleys, is how is that virtuous? Is it prompting some virtue? Should we emulate him? Or should we look at Astrophil and go, man, this is not how a person should behave. This is not how a person should act. You really can take that interpretation either way. I tend to change depending on whatever I'm thinking or reading at the moment. Sometimes I'll get Astrophil and I'm like, brother, you're a fool. And then sometimes I understand exactly what he's saying. So unpack that in your thinking of Astrophil and Stella. It's a pretty fascinating journey through Astrophil's emotions and what sort of impact do the emotions that we feel about love have on us. So after you read through Astrophil and Stella and discuss that and think about that, we're going to move over to Shakespeare's sonnets. Now, Shakespeare's sonnets are a completely, I know they talk about love, it's a different view of love, and you can compare those in your discussion board post. But one of the things that's interesting about Shakespeare's work is that much of the first part of the sonnets are written not from a man to a woman, but from a man to another man. And certainly people have interpreted that as that there's some latent homosexuality there, or what we would call homosocial behavior, that Shakespeare is challenging some of those principles there. Or you could also just see that as Shakespeare using the language of love to discuss, to really represent the role of friendship and a togetherness and a bond that is certainly stronger than he's just my friend. So there's a lot of opportunity there. I don't want to guide you. There's much to read about Shakespeare and his history and his life and to whom he's writing. There's a lot of things that you can discuss. They are all open to you in discussion, right? Especially as you move into other things like the discussion of the Dark Lady sonnets. And what do we do with the Dark Lady? What is Shakespeare actually saying? How is he interpreting that? What do you do with the last psalm in these notes here, which is Psalm 130, which you've probably heard before, which is "My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun," where he describes in all of these ways that his mistress is not all that appealing to him by the world standards, but then he closes it with this couplet, and yet by heaven I think my love is rare, as any she belied with false compare. And one of the major themes that you're going to see in Shakespeare's work is the imminent threat of time. Time is forever progressing forward. There's this idea in all of this work, but specifically it's one that they struggle with in the Renaissance, which is the idea of mutability, that everything is changing. And you think about how mutability is consistently pressing us forward. You look different now than you did 10 years ago, right? And as I look at my life and what a lot of these authors deal with, being turning 42 this year, I notice I have a lot less hair than I used to when I was younger, a lot more wrinkles on my face, and that my legs and knees and back hurt a lot more than they used to. That's the same as mutability, that no one stays in this specific beautiful time forever, that time is always marching on. And Shakespeare gives some prescriptions of how his friend, or in whatever capacity, can stop the threat of time. And one of those ways is progeny. Have children. Pass on those things that are beautiful about you to the next generation. And one of them is poetry. And that he says that this writing, as long as people can read and understand it, that this writing will keep you alive. And there's a lot of connections that you can draw there between Shakespeare and the idea of birth and the idea of a child and birthing of a poem. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who is actually a poet, and I shared it's actually Sydney's sonnets with him, but it's the same principle. And he loved the idea of a poet giving birth, and so you can see that connection within Shakespeare's work. So take a look at the notes. There is much there to consider, much there to wrestle through, more than I can cover in a short lecture video. And this is not really even a lecture video, but just a way to read through the ideas, think about them. What's most important to me, as always in these assignments, is not that you feel the same way that I do about these texts, but that you take an open mind into discussing them so that you can read through and understand them and think through them and try to do something with them in your own writing. I am not concerned about, at this stage, whether you are right in whatever sense that means. It's difficult to be right about something like literary interpretation. But what I am interested in is that you have a strong point of view that you want to support with examples from the text. So, going back to our discussion board post, because we're doing more works in this place, there's actually 6 discussion board prompts that you can focus on. Some of those we've already touched on a little bit. One, in the defense of poesy, where Sidney talks about teaching and delighting. You have to ask the question of his own work, and if you were reading some of his other stuff, like the Arcadia, what does it teach? How does it delight? And what virtue is at the end of this? It's the question you can ask about Astrophil and Stella. What is the relationship between love and suffering? I mean, Astrophil is in many ways like the most suffering person that you can read about, and yet he continues to love and go and pursue it. So explore that idea. What is that relationship between love and suffering, and perhaps around the question of, is it truly love if you're not suffering? If there's not some measure of pain, are you actually really pursuing love? Thirdly, consider both the works themselves and see how they define love. So a lot of times we have this idea of, I know what love means, but if we apply it in different contexts, we realize, no, love's the variations of other things. In fact, C.S. Lewis, he's a Christian and literary scholar from the 20th century, and one of his has a book called The Four Loves, where he explores 4 different types of love. And even in his literary criticism, talks about the allegory of love and how there's a bunch of different definitions. And so explore those definitions a little bit and draw some comparisons between them. Is there a similarity between Astrophil and Stella and the love that Shakespeare's speaker has for the fair youth? even though that one is a male-female relationship and one is a male-male relationship. What do we do with the Dark Lady sonnets as compared to what we see Astrophil and Stella do? And so that's kind of a grab bag category to go with and do whatever you want to with it. Same question for Shakespeare as we asked of Sidney. What sort of virtue is he inspiring? How does he teach and delight with these sonnets? And then there's the mention of the Dark Lady sonnets if you wanted to focus on that in particular. And in that one, I asked you to bring in some aspects of modern conceptions of love. We like to think that somehow we've arrived over the last 400 years at some greater sense of intelligence or stability, but in reality, we're still the same people doing the same things that Shakespeare did, that Sidney did, and that idea of what C.S. Lewis calls chronological snobbery, that somehow we're different and better than the people that came before us, is wrong. And these poems show us exactly that, because in a lot of ways they still have room to teach us. A lot of ways we're going to see ourselves reflected in that. One of the reasons why I love to continue to read and to teach this work. And then finally, really, if you're interested in Shakespeare's discussion of time and digging in to how he depicts time and what he represents as the remedies we have against time, there's the last post for you there. So thank you guys again. This is one of those great pleasures of teaching, is that something that I love, that I'm passionate about, I get to share with you, and so I'm really looking forward to reading your work on these sonnets, because they are fascinating, and it's really great for people to read them for the first time under new lenses perhaps. And even if you are familiar with these sonnets, with Shakespeare sonnets, you may not be familiar with Sidney sonnets. If you're familiar with both, you may not have read them in the context of the Knight's Tale, and continuing to see those ideas come together. So have fun this week exploring these ideas, and please reach out to me with any questions you have, any concerns you have. Email is cmoody, CMOODY, @aum.edu. Have a great week.